A remark on the sources. Before we dive into the life story of Al-Tabari, one of history's greatest scholars, we need to talk about something important. Where does our information about him actually come from? This matters because, as you'll see, piecing together his biography is a bit like solving a puzzle with some missing pieces. Al-Tabari lived from around 839 to 923 CE, which in the Islamic calendar is roughly 224 to 310 AH. That's over 1,000 years ago, so naturally, we're working with limited information. And here's the interesting thing, Tabari himself didn't like talking about his personal life. In all his preserved writings, he rarely mentions anything about himself. He might have opened up more in some of his lost works, but we'll never know for sure. What we do get from Tabari are the names of scholars he studied with. When he writes phrases like, "I was told," or, "we were told," at the beginning of his transmission chains, he's usually indicating direct personal contact with these teachers. But frustratingly, he almost never tells us when or where these meetings happened. He was too focused on the scholarly content to bother with what he probably considered trivial biographical details. There's another complication. Tabari often pretended to rely on oral transmission when he was actually working from written sources. This was common practice at the time. He'd cite someone he had met personally, but then quote from that person's published books rather than from memory of their conversations. So when we try to figure out who he actually knew and how well, we have to read between the lines. Now, who actually wrote about Tabari's life? Surprisingly, nobody wrote a full biography while he was alive. But several people who knew him personally did leave us valuable information. The most important early source is Ibn Kamil, who lived from 873 to 961 CE. He was a judge and scholar who was close to Tabari and was actually present when Tabari died. He followed Tabari's legal school for a while, though he seems to have drifted away from it later. His monograph on Tabari became the foundation that later biographers built upon. Another key source is Al-Farghani, who lived from 895 to 972 CE. He was Tabari's student and later prepared an edition of Tabari's famous history, adding his own continuation to it. He included a long obituary for Tabari that gives us precious biographical details. He even left us a teaching license from 948 CE that lists which of Tabari's works he was authorized to teach. The Egyptian historian Ibn Yunus, who lived from 894 to 958 CE, also wrote about Tabari. Since Tabari had visited Egypt to study, Ibn Yunus naturally included him in his work about foreign scholars who came to Egypt. About 300 years later, the Egyptian scholar Al-Kifti wrote another biography of Tabari. He was clearly a huge fan, mentioning Tabari not just in this dedicated work but also in his dictionaries of grammarians and poets. Here's the problem though, none of these early biographies have survived intact. What we have are excerpts quoted by later scholars. The oldest preserved source is the History of Baghdad by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who lived from 1002 to 1071 CE. Almost every later biographer quoted from his work. Ibn Asakir, who lived from 1105 to 1176 CE, included a long entry on Tabari in his History of Damascus, since Tabari had spent time there during his travels. He went beyond what Al-Khatib had written and added material from older sources. But the most extensive coverage comes from Yaqut, the famous geographer and biographer who died in 1229 CE. He was friends with Al-Kifti and shared his enthusiasm for Tabari. Yaqut's article on Tabari in his Dictionary of Learned Men reproduces long passages from the old sources, apparently quoting them word for word. Other notable biographies appear in works by Ibn al-Jawzi, al-Dhahabi, and Taj al-Din al-Subki, all written between the 12th and 14th centuries. Now, we have to be honest about the limitations of these sources. They're all pretty favorable to Tabari. In fact, they might idealize him a bit. Tabari had strong opinions on religion, law, and society, which means he definitely made enemies. But those enemies didn't leave us any biographical accounts, so we only hear one side of the story. We should probably question whether all the anecdotes about Tabari really happened exactly as reported. And there's always a temptation to assume that any famous person must have met every other famous person of their time. So what's the right approach? Unless we have solid proof that something didn't happen, we should probably accept the reports as reflecting reality, or at least reflecting how Tabari's contemporaries perceived him. Either way, these accounts give us legitimate material for understanding his life, even if we need to use some caution. With all that said about our sources, let's now move on to explore what they tell us about this remarkable scholar's life.